Welcome to Finding Avalon, the podcast that amplifies disabled voices. I'm your host, Jenna, a disability inclusion advocate, communicator, and storyteller. This is a place where disabled folks correct the narrative by sharing authentic lived experiences. Join me as we explore life with disability through our lens, because representation matters. When disability changed my life, I rapidly began to experience the world through a very different lens. For the first while, because my disability was mostly non-apparent, I had what's known as passing privilege. I could pass as non-disabled, like the majority of people living with disability. You can't always detect chronic pain, for example, or post-concussion syndrome, or an autoimmune illness. For a while, the non-visible nature of my disability shielded me from overt discrimination. But when I started being more vocal about how I was struggling, and when I identified as needing accommodation, or otherwise spoke about being further disabled by systemic barriers, all of that began to change. I was met with disbelief, discomfort, cynicism, dismissive comments and jokes. And I was told I wasn't disabled because I looked just fine. I couldn't possibly be disabled because I didn't match their limited idea of what disability means. In other words, to them, a white cane and sunglasses, a wheelchair, or a visible difference or disfigurement. Besides, it couldn't be that bad because I looked so good on the outside. And quote, "You're too young to have so many health issues." Or, "Why would you ever want to label yourself something like that? Are you looking for attention?" I was shamed by deeply unhealthy people in my own life. Toxic people who also sprayed me with their sexist, racist, homophobic, and ableist mindsets and their own very dysfunctional values and behaviors that they refused to confront and address. This only alienated me more and caused me so much distress. So many parts of my core identity felt under attack. And so, after many years, I separated from these toxic people with the guidance and support of counselors and loved ones. But even after that, I still faced casually harmful ableist attitudes in society, including in the wellness industry, where emphasis is often placed on toxic positivity, emotional and spiritual bypass, and Eurocentric ableist ideals that push the message of disabled or chronically ill people having brought it on themselves somehow, and being expected to fix it themselves and apologize for themselves. I was frequently shamed and told that I had no right to claim to be disabled because others had it worse than me, and I should be thankful. At least you didn't die. At least it's not cancer. Could be worse. Of course, this came from the mouths of non-disabled people with no experience or knowledge whatsoever, just full to the brim with stigma, bias, and straight-up ignorance. I heard every ableist euphemism in the book, patronizing terms that center and comfort non-disabled people, while also invalidating and infantilizing disabled people. I started to really listen to the words that were being used around me, the kinds of jokes and tropes and stereotypes. And even though those words and jokes weren't being made at my expense back then, at least not for several more years until I became more disabled, it still doesn't take it happening to you for you to be able to identify that it's wrong, it's discrimination, and it harms others. I was often told, "At least you don't look disabled," or that I was too smart, too well-spoken, too pretty, too young, or even too well-dressed to possibly be disabled. Seriously, what does that mean? As my disabilities developed and worsened and became more complicated as they were intertwined with one another in different ways, they impacted my ability to do my job, to earn money, to manage my daily life, to be social, carefree, to feel secure. Yet I was dismissed at not being disabled enough, even when people could see I was having terrible pain and definite mobility restrictions. And at the same time, if I spoke up for my access needs or accommodations, or if I pointed out general accessibility needs for others, I was called too much, too negative, or a goody two-shoes. What surprised me the most was the negative reaction towards disability and chronic illness, and people's fragility and defensiveness around their discriminatory behavior. The constantly dismissive and negative remarks started to take a toll. They started to creep into my inner thoughts and my inner voice. Many of us who care about diversity, equity, and inclusion have learned about what white fragility means as a common reaction when it comes to calls for people to become actively anti-racist. And similarly, in the disability community, I began to see that knee-jerk reaction of abled fragility. People who were entitled and disturbed if they were expected to even do the bare minimum for disability and accessibility rights. Even those who were behaving in outright discriminatory, ableist ways, offensive ways, they would become outraged when called out for their problematic behavior and words and for excluding people. And then, of course, that would be followed swiftly by a blanket denial of being ableist. I don't discriminate against disabled people. You're not even disabled anyway. None of it made any sense to me. As I became more disabled, barriers I'd never encountered before suddenly appeared. I found myself increasingly limited in a world that had once been wide open to me. A shift was felt socially as well. People's behavior, words, and attitudes made those barriers even higher. It cut deeper. Even people I respected and loved casually used ableist slurs. The clear message I was receiving was disabled was bad, less, something to avoid, to hide, to shun, to distance yourself from, or to laugh at. There was no human or humanity connected. And this is exactly what's meant when we talk about othering people. Over time, I noticed my opportunities had started to lessen. And I was spoken to and treated like I was something to be wary of. No longer someone, but something. I began to be excluded, or decisions began to be made for me without ever asking me, in that classic ableist patronizing way. She won't be able to go on that excursion anyway, you know. She'll either be in pain, or she'll leave early, or she'll slow us down. A friend confided that this was a conversation they found themselves a part of. The friend made sure to make a point to say, well, you should ask her first. Let her decide. It was a very helpless feeling, they explained to me. So that person had noticed ableism, they had noticed the discrimination, but didn't know how to change course of that conversation. And that's where anti-ableism education for all of us can come into play in a situation like that, where you can speak up for somebody's rights. Where once I had been welcome, I began to feel both invisible and inconvenient at the same time. When I advocated for myself or for others, I became a problem, or a troublemaker, or even a killjoy. No matter how I worded it, no matter how I approached it, whether it was in a warm and friendly manner, a polite manner, a neutral manner, reasonably and logically, it was not welcome. And by extension, I realized people like me were not welcome. Most of all, I began to witness how discrimination against disabled people negatively and constantly impacted a large part of our community. I started to notice inaccessibility everywhere, things that my non-disabled privileged eyes would never have picked up on before. And through this, I began to realize and confront my own internalized ableism too. Society has convinced us that being disabled is something to be ashamed of, to step back from, to distance yourself from. And yet, ableism still remains largely unchallenged by the majority of society because prejudice is so deeply ingrained in our lives, our media, and even the language that we use. I'd always believed inclusion was for everyone, but when I found myself edged out and othered more and more, confused at suddenly being on the outside looking in, it felt like a slow but seismic shift, one that wrongly divides people's worth based on ability and health. When I understood what was happening and I learned more about where this inequality was rooted, there was no question that I would take action for myself and for others. So, with my East Coast sense of community and my strong personal sense of justice, I gathered my inner resources and I set out to be part of the solution. I started to learn more about ableism and, more specifically, anti-ableism. But what is ableism? And why do we need to get rid of it if we ever want to achieve a truly inclusive and accessible world? Ableism is one of those isms, a social phobia as serious as racism, sexism, ageism, classism, and all of those other harmful isms that divide and discriminate. Ableism is part of an often hostile set of beliefs and behaviors, and it's all rooted in stereotypes, fear, and ignorance. It's often unconscious and unintentional. It's a belief that people who are living without disabilities are superior, and they deserve to have more rights and access in society. Many people wrongly assume that disabled people are defined by their conditions and need fixing, correcting, pitying, or even hiding away. And ableism leads to unacceptable and dangerous inequities in all corners of our society: poverty, housing instability, exclusion from educational and professional opportunities, serious healthcare failures and worse healthcare outcomes for people who are disabled, and the very real risk and reality of abuse and neglect by intimate partners, family members, and even caregivers. Disabled people, because of ableism, face harassment and bullying in workplaces and in social circles and online spaces. Somebody who is ableist may consciously or unconsciously hold prejudice against people with disabilities, and as a result, these negative and incorrect messages can also be absorbed and internalized by disabled people themselves. So it follows that unlearning ableism and prioritizing inclusion of all people in our communities can make a lasting and positive change. For nearly 20 years, I had built a career as a trusted public relations professional. And in the last decade or so, I also heavily leaned into being an agent of change who could then help transform others into empowered inclusion advocates and allies. If you're listening into this podcast and supporting a disabled content creator, and all of those advocates and leaders I feature each episode, you're actually taking an important step to learning more about disability. Whether that's gathering ideas for how to better self-advocate as a disabled person yourself, or how to follow disabled folks' lead as a supportive community ally who's committed to becoming actively anti-ableist. And that's something I'll be talking about more in this podcast, so I hope you'll keep joining us and just watch this space. Disability is a very common and human experience. It can happen to anyone at any time without exception, from birth, through illness or injury, simply as we age, and sometimes with absolutely no explanation at all. Over 1.6 billion people live with disabilities that significantly impact their daily lives. We are the world's largest, most diverse minority group, and when nearly 90% of all disabilities are not apparent, we can't know what a person is facing each day. or the systemic barriers that they're struggling with, barriers that we ourselves might even be contributing to or upholding. That's why it's absolutely crucial to listen and believe when disabled people share our experiences. And do you know what we need? We need allies, friends and community members like you to stand by us and work alongside us to break these barriers and push for real progress. I live with multiple disabilities that are mostly non apparent. They're unpredictable, always changing, and they impact my life every day. And like so many other disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent people, I've been forced to mask and hide my pain, my symptoms, and my traits to protect myself. Because while disability doesn't discriminate, society does. People do. We live in a world that is still intolerant and dismissive of those who are different. Disabled people face harmful and exhausting systemic barriers everywhere in society, from the healthcare system and the professional world to learning spaces and social circles. The more disabled I became, the more discrimination I faced in each of these environments. In fact, I experienced increased ableism when I became more vocal about anti-ableism, disabled human rights, and even basic accessibility. I faced, and I still face, bullying and hostility, even hate speech for existing as a disabled person in public spaces and online. How dare I identify or speak up for myself and others? Because in an ableist's narrow view, surely disability couldn't look, sound, or act like me. Spoiler alert, disability can look like every single one of us. Forget the stereotypes. Nobody has a right to judge or proclaim that a person is disabled or not, or disabled enough to use their voice and share their experiences and identify as disabled. Today in Atlantic Canada, 1 in 4 people live with disability that significantly impacts their daily life. 1 in 4. That's the highest rate of disability in Canada. And worldwide, 1 in 6 people live with some form of disability, and many actually live with 2 or more conditions at the same time. And when we factor in mental health disability, which has more than tripled in the last 5 years in Canada, disability is growing. We have just lived through a historic, mass disabling global event, a pandemic that killed and disabled and worsened existing health conditions. Disability isn't something that happens in a far off land to some poor, unfortunate person that you have nothing in common with. No, it happens to you. It happens to me. It happens to the people we love. It happens to the person we pass on the street. And there is no look to disability. There's no one set of factors to detect. There's no one performance of disability. Disability is as diverse as our population is, and as diverse as our life experiences are. And that means we must widen our view of what disability is, and not only accept that disability is a part of human life, but also to expect it and to plan for it. We're flesh and blood. We're not invincible. And being disabled is not being less or broken. Disabled people's lives and contributions have just as much value as anyone else's. Our identities and our experiences and expertise are all valid. Anywhere you find yourself, whether you realize it or not, disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent people are all around you. We're right here, leading similar lives, but often while navigating a very different obstacle course on an uneven playing field. And that's if we can access the field to begin with. The reality is, discrimination limits and harms disabled people far more than our actual conditions do. Inaccessibility and exclusion disables us far more than our own disabilities do. We are more disabled by a society that refuses to adapt to diverse human needs. Even in 2025, we are shut out by inaccessible environments, ground down by broken systems, and dehumanized by discrimination. Not only is this unacceptable, it's completely fixable. Disability is not something that any one person should be expected to overcome. Instead, it's society's stigma and inequity that must be overcome. It's those barriers in our systems and biases in our attitudes that need correcting. Oppression must be overcome, not the people it harms. We have a choice to be on the right side of history and resist upholding these systems of oppression. It takes an entire community to turn the tide against disability discrimination. We can all choose to become more aware, more educated, more active, and more vocal. The world needs disruptors and defenders, change makers who protect people's human rights, and that includes disabled people's human rights. Real change and real transformation happens when we collectively commit to taking action to build a community that welcomes, values, and protects everyone, not just some people, everyone. And to make this real change happen, we must be willing to learn and unlearn, adapt, and act as a community. And this can only be accomplished together. And I make this appeal today as an advocate who knows that I can't do this alone. Nobody can. Besides, it was never meant to be a solo mission. It takes a whole community made up of self-advocates and supportive allies to banish ableism and to put an end to disability discrimination. After all, at the very center of the word inclusion, you'll find us. Thank you so much for being here and supporting this podcast. We are now more than halfway through season 1, and I want to invite you to stay along for the ride. To help me reach more people with my advocacy message, follow, like, share, and comment wherever you get your podcasts. Special artist thanks and credit for the unreleased feature song Coal Miner, written by Steve Hoskins, arranged by Naomi Kavka, and performed by Naomi Kavka, Bryn Porter, and Tony Kostelik. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode, and we will see you again soon.